Hey guys, Coach Canteri here to go over the hip hinge. The hip hinge is a prerequisite movement pattern prior to doing any deadlift variation or honestly before lifting anything heavy off the floor. Unlike the squat, which requires max hip and knee flexion, the hip hinge requires max hip flexion with minimal knee flexion. And although this movement pattern may look simple, it can be quite complex and done incorrectly more times than not. Therefore, this video will go over your stance, posture, and hip hinge patterns in regards to some common mistakes and coaching cues to get you moving and feeling better. So first thing is the stance. Common mistake for the stance would be the big toe. People tend to, as they reach their hips back, let the toes peel off the ground. It's important to keep that on the floor. So you can simply fix this mistake by cueing your client to squish a bug with their big toe as they reach their hips back. Or you can use something like a mini band, place it around the ball of their feet. Now they can kind of feel the band through their shoes. So I have a tactile cue to press down on something. And then as I reach my hips back, if my toes come off, the band will actually pull my feet together. So the band is a great tool to give someone some real-time feedback in terms of whether or not their big toe is staying pinned on the ground. The second common mistake when it comes to the stance would be the knee position. People tend to, as they reach their hips back, they start to bend the knees, they turn it into more of a squat pattern. So to correct this, you can have them get into a soft knee position to start with, and then kind of cue them to keep this fixed or frozen, or you can even physically hold their knee themselves, or yourself for them, as they reach their hips back. Another way to do this would be have the client kind of maybe press like a PVC pipe on like the top of their foot here. And then as they reach their hips back, the knee shouldn't come any closer to the PVC pipe. If I were to do this incorrectly, as I reach my hips back and I bend my knee, either my knee would touch the PVC or it goes past it. So it's just, again, another way to self-correct when it comes to your stance. On to posture. People tend to either A, overextend as they reach their hips back, or B, start to round. Regardless if you overextend or round, an easy way to fix this mistake would be with a PVC pipe with 3 points of contact. And your 3 points are your head, your upper back, and your lower back. You can see if I'm already overextended, you can see how much space I have between my spine and the PVC pipe. So I do a posterior pelvic tilt, my rib cage down, the space is much more smaller. And now from here, since I'm in a good position, I will maintain my 3 points of contact as I reach my hips back and forward. If I were to round, as I reach back, I lose 1 point of contact. Or if I were to reach my hips back and overextend, again, I lose my point of contact. So again, regardless of the posture or position when it comes to this mistake, the 3 points of contact is a great way to correct either variation. And then last but not least, the pattern itself. The hip hinge is simply a posterior weight shift, meaning I bring my hips back, I bring my hips forward. The first common mistake when it comes to the hinge is people don't incorporate a posterior weight shift. Instead, the hips remain in that same position and they just drop their shoulders down to the floor and back up. If you find that either you or a client is doing this, you could have them step in front of a wall or a rack, and then simply just cue them to reach their hips back, to touch the wall or pole behind them, then bring their hips forward. So if I were to do this incorrectly, my hips or my butt wouldn't be touching the wall. So again, a great way to self-correct. Another way you can cue them would be if you didn't have like a wall or a rack at your leisure, right? You can have your client place their hands in the crease of their hips here. So then as they reach their hips back, you should almost feel the hips fold into the hands. And then last but not least, when it comes to this mistake, a way to correct it is you can grab a band, have the client step into the band. The band's going to go around the hips. So now this band with this resistance is already trying to pull my hips back. So it's going to really pull me into this position so I get a good feel of where my hips should be going, and then I can bring my hips forward. The next common mistake when it comes to the hinge pattern is you'll have people who move their hips back properly, but then they get to a point where once they are, again, they're at end range in terms of their hamstring length, they'll allow their shoulders to keep moving towards the ground without any hip posterior weight shift. So again, a great way to fix this is, again, standing in front of a wall or a rack, having them reach their hips back. Once again, the butt hits the rack, I'm not going to allow my chest to go any further. My chest stops. Focusing again on just the hips only. Once the hips stop moving, the chest stops moving. So the last mistake when it comes to the hinge pattern itself is not necessarily on the way back, but on the way up. So instead of driving my hips forward and squeezing my glutes at the top, some people will actually throw their shoulders backwards. So if that's the case, we can go back to the band to correct this error. So I reach my hips back, good hip hinge. Now I have the band pulling backwards. I have a little bit of load and resistance to feel how it would feel to drive forward, squeeze my glutes at the top to kind of, again, reference this good finished position. If I were to do this incorrectly and I threw my shoulders back instead, I would actually get pulled backwards by the band. So again, this is a great tool to help kind of coach or correct that lockout by driving your hips through and squeezing your glutes at the top. So with that said, those are just a few mistakes and coaching cues in regards to your stance, your position, your posture, and the hinge pattern itself. Hopefully you can kind of apply this information to your hip hinge and or deadlift to help you move and feel better.